Okay. Well, good morning and welcome to Reducing Bias in Healthcare AI Models, a panel discussion. My name is Enrique Vargas, and I'm a business development executive from IBM Research right here in Yorktown, New York. With me today is Sam DeBrouwer and Manoj Karamchandani. So welcome, Manoj and Sam. Just a few words to introduce my esteemed guests here. Sam is the Chief Strategy Officer at Sharecare, the digital health company that helps people manage all their health in one place. She has over 25 years of experience at the intersection of technology, health, and research, including co-founding 4 companies. Welcome, Sam. And if I've missed anything about your bio, or you want to say anything more about your experience with AI, by all means.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. As I mentioned, we also have Manoj Karamchandani. Manoj is the CEO of Empect Inc. Empect is a company that specializes in developing next-generation regulatory compliance platforms. Manoj has over 25 years of experience in life sciences, AI, blockchain, AR/VR, and technology integration. Welcome, Manoj, and if there's anything else I missed from your bio or anything you wanted to add, by all means.
No, Enrique, you've done great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be on this panel.
Thank you.
So please go ahead.
Thank you. Brilliant. So as I mentioned at the top of the call, the discussion is reducing bias in healthcare AI models. So I just wanted to ask each of you some questions and get your perspective. And Sam, if you don't mind, I wanted to start with you. And my question for you is, so we hear a lot about AI and we hear a lot about bias in AI, and particularly you hear about it from the perspective of facial recognition, but in healthcare, it means something a little different. So I just wanted to hear from you, from your perspective, what are the problems with bias and fairness in the healthcare industry today? Yeah,
no, it's, and thank you for having me this morning. It's very glad to be here. Really appreciate. So it's a big issue. Bias are everywhere, and it starts with us human beings before even, it starts with the machines. And I think when it comes to bias, and in healthcare, even more impactful than in other industry. But you see, when we talk about AI, we talk about data, we talk about augmentation, and it all starts with the collection of the data and why we collect that data and how we collect it. So I think if we don't do the work even before that, to make sure that we have the right data sets, the good representations, that the intent is really transparent and well explained, we will keep on having bias. So it really starts at the beginning of the process. And of course, at the end and the entire journey of how that data is being processed and worked with. And of course, at the end of that journey, making sure, again, having extra methodologies to debias algorithms, because again, it's practically impossible to avoid bias. So it's something you want to have all along the journey of building those algorithms.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Manoj, I wanted to turn to you for a second and ask you a similar question, but you come at it from a unique perspective, which is you're familiar with a lot of the things going on in a regulatory or auditing framework. Is there anything you wanted to add to talk about, the problems with AI and bias and fairness in healthcare?
So I totally, first of all, agree with Sam over here. Humans itself, the way we are built, are biased. There's a bias built to it. So how do we build machines which are less biased than humans? So that is the biggest challenge of all. And obviously there will be bias. There will be issues that are going to be there. We see them currently on all of our systems. If you look at Facebook, if you look at TikTok, if you look at YouTube, if you look at facial recognition done by the government, if you do, so there is an inbuilt bias and there is a perception that there is a bias. So how do we address that inbuilt bias, and how do we ensure that the perception that has been built is minimized. To do that, there are frameworks that needs to be developed, so we can go into detail during our discussions. But there is a lot of progress being made, and a lot of progress needs to be made still.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. So now, Sam, I wanted to turn back to you for a moment and just, take a further dive back from where we started. And can you tell us how do we tackle the shortfalls in AI and reduce bias in AI algorithms? Is there anything you wanted to say about that?
Well, yeah, so I don't have a magic stock, but there are a few things certainly I think we should do systematically, and it's not there yet. It's almost like having a checklist before you even start building an algorithm. Again, from the data collection part, like, again, what are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? How do we make sure we have, diverse pools of data? And so it's interesting, for the Moderna vaccine, there were about 3 weeks delays because HHS went to Moderna telling them they didn't have enough diversity in the data. So they had to go back and recruit more people coming from diverse background. And it shows how it starts very early on in healthcare. It starts at the clinical research part, which has historically, failed really having, being able to reach out to diverse populations when it comes to participation in clinical trials. And that's something, for example, with my team, we've been focusing very much on. And some of the things we've been working on at Sharecare, for example, is that concept of community well-being index, working with communities, creating zip codes, making sure that when you recruit people for clinical trials, you have diversity pipelines. Again, when you recruit participants, when you collect the data, making sure you have a good representation of the population to start with, because we already know that there are certain treatment, for example, that works better on certain populations than others. So that's, these are the kind of disconnect we want to avoid. So that's where it starts. The type of data being collected, I think that where AI can help and where we have to pay a lot of attention is why we collect that data and how we make sure we have, very transparent process where we involve more people in the process, because at the end of the day, that data comes from us. It's our data. So we should be fully involved, and processes should be very transparent. And there are ways in AI today to allow that. So for example, and it's all about trust. So for example, it is possible today to store and train and compute and train the data locally on the phone. So you can basically ask people to collect data and participate to these algorithms without sharing that data back to the cloud, and still they contribute. There are other ways, such as federated learning, where instead of sharing data, people share the learnings. So if they don't feel super comfortable about sharing their data, this is how you build trust. It's almost like transparency by design, but also consent by design. What we've seen, the big trends with regulators, we have been asked to, to be more respectful of the privacy, to treat privacy as a first-class citizen. And so it's not only something coming from the regulators, it's also the right thing to do. And so this is also part of the entire process where you build trust, and AI can help there. But there's also, once you build your models, once you do the analysis, making sure you have environments where the teams building those models are also, the teams helping collecting those data should be also a good representation of the population. And the teams doing the analysis and making those models should have checklists as well. And there are AI machine learning environment today called data fluency that are trying to avoid the black box effect, that we have a really good understanding of why we have those models and different type of filters and the right expertise around the table, not only AI engineers. AI algorithms, health algorithms are too important to left over only to engineers. And I love engineers, I work with them every day. But so I think it's an entire journey we have to work on.
I like the way you said that. It's,
No,
AI bias by design or AI bias by accident.
and
I'm sorry, Manoj, were you going to say something?
it's a very good question. So, first of all, we are looking at data, and Sam, I totally agree with you. Secondly, is algorithms. Now, a lot of companies are hiding under the algorithms. Nobody wants to share the algorithms.
Right.
You talk about transparency, right? So you talk. I'll give you a recent example of TikTok. The reason there was so much resistance of TikTok was they do not want to share algorithms. Algorithms, they're saying this is the core of our success or our company, and that becomes a major issue. So how do we ensure the transparency while not really exposing the core IP of the company? That is it, and that is the pushback that one feels. And I believe there should be framework that needs to be developed. They are being developed right now. They're being suggested. But I have done some audits where people are saying, hey, look, this is not an AI system, keep away from it. And the algorithm in this, I can't share.
Right, right. It's interesting. You bring up a great point. I've had some experience with another regulated industry, which is financial services. And one of the challenges that they have is, okay, back to you, there's two ways to think about it. You can think about it from it's a trade secret, I don't want to tell anybody, but you also can think about it from the perspective of, well, I'm not sure why it did what it did, so I don't really want to tell you because I couldn't explain. right. So it's like, so magic, please don't look behind the curtain. So explainability in trusted AI is a big difference. But I wanted, yeah, I'm sorry, please.
Yeah, Manoj touched on something that is quite core here. It's the IP component, because this can be such a blocker. And there are two things. So in the healthcare industry, it's amazing because there's so much data, but the big dirty secret is that half of that data is not usable because there's so much legacy. It has not been collected properly. So we try to build models with it, but it doesn't work really well. But the other half is actually very valuable. And so what is interesting is that data traditionally comes from medical records, from claims, but what we've been focusing on is the edge of the network, where people live, which is the last device of the network. It's a smartphone, it's a wearable, it's the sensors, and there's a ton of data being generated every single day that we have not been able to access. There's also the new type of sequencing and all that. And that data is generating by people and they have it on their phone. So they kind of own it. So that's creating another dynamic. But when it comes to the IP, that's a very interesting conversation. And that's why the federated learning in AI can, and it's in certain situations, it's called transfer learning. It's even used at the country level, countries that are involved in massive clinical trials and they don't want the data to leave the country and still they want, models and algorithms. And so federated learning is something that is even used internally in companies. The large companies, they don't share data between departments, again, for IP and security reasons. And so there's, and it's a
I agree.
Right? We have those silos.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe you don't want, because of GDPR, maybe your German branch doesn't want to let data flow out of its data center to its New York branch,
Those are very true things. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, so it's interesting how sometimes technology goes a bit faster than regulation. So federated learning, so there are now committees and IEEE's committees around decentralized clinical trials, and all those topics are addressed. But again, the regulator is not as fast when it comes to the technology that enables all these things.
So can I wanted to step back, and I have a question I don't want to forget for you, Manoj, but back to you, Sam, on one other thing. We talked about some of the pain points, but what are the opportunities?
Yeah, so it's a great question because it's really what I do every day. So what I was sharing with you last time is we happen to be able to address the 4 major pain points in healthcare with our AI technologies. And so the 4 pain points are data. how the data is collected, where, how you normalize that data. So it's the data engineering part, extremely hard in healthcare. Even if there are standards, it can be very messy. So we are able to do that with the available tech stack in our community. The second pain points are the pipelines. Again, the data is more diversified than ever. It's not only, medical records, claims,
IoT, yep.
right? Exactly. It's bioinformatics pipeline for the new type of sequencing, and also the environment to process and analyze that data. I was referring to data fluency that enables that. Then you have privacy. I think privacy is already one of the major conversation, right? And so again, privacy has to be by design. Consent has to be by design. We have to be more granular. It can't be just one time and that's it. It has to be at every step of the process.
Yeah.
Again,
Sorry to interrupt you. Privacy is one of the key components of it. And I think a lot of big corporations hide under the privacy thing. And governments EU is way ahead of US or globally anywhere in the world, besides China, right? So the issue comes into is there is a privacy and legislators need to be in place and where the privacy is protected. And GDPR came into play. And the penalties on GDPR are so huge that the companies are really looking into it.
That's right.
And everyone has that on their nameplate that, hey, look, we're GDPR compliant or we are working towards it.
Yeah.
My question is, why is it not being done in the US?
Well, it's starting, it's slow, but California, we have CCPA, so we're based in California with my team. So those are, this is a first step. I think, it takes time. Again, we in the US, we have different states. But, I think there's also, I was saying, I don't know if you, I'm sure you agree, there is regulation and there is the right thing to do. And for me, I didn't wait for the regulator to come with those. I've been very excited by the technologies we are using with my team, like federated learning, edge computing, edge native, because it's serving this privacy purpose on which you can build trust with the consumers and the patients. So that was, for me, the big promise. So I think we have to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, just Manoj, I will say from my experience at IBM, global companies are dealing with this. It's really gnarly. It's not an easy problem, but they're taking it very seriously and trying to find ways to operate in an environment that is global, that is doing the right thing, like you said, Sam, and helping preserve that privacy. Manoj,
yes,
I wanted to talk to you. So I guess everyone talks about AI like it's been around forever, but as you well know, the truth is that really it's only been practical in the last 10 years or so with the advent of more powerful microprocessors and GPUs and development of neural networks and so forth. But no technology exists in a vacuum, and particularly when it comes to healthcare. Can you talk about the issues related to some of the regulatory or auditing frameworks that are, surround and, are above the technology?
No, that is so true. So one of the question that comes back to me, so we do advise companies and consult with companies where we say, hey, look, here is how we do some regulations. How do we ensure that these regulations are in place? And there is right now a vacuum there in regulatory framework. The vacuum is creating either extreme on one side or the extreme on the other side, where companies are doing it, where I believe, hey, because it's lack of understanding of the regulations and lack of regulations. And a single framework is an issue. I believe if we work towards a mature auditing framework, which can be used across the board, understanding that, hey, look, here is what we do and here's what is done. And that if that framework is like a COBIT framework, right? We have COBIT framework, it's accepted, financial systems are audited and everything is done and people accept that to a limit. There are some people who do not do it properly. But if we have a regulatory network framework which is approved by the governments and by the corporates, I think we have a lot of opportunity to go towards that perception that has been built that these are not regulated. The other thing that comes into play is definition of AI. And
good point.
So is it augmented intelligence? Is it automated intelligence? So those things come into play. It's like, what is AI and where do we define? So clear definition of artificial intelligence, a good framework. It would not be a perfect framework, but good frameworks, and they are being suggested. Actually, COVID has suggested a decent framework, and I'll kind of read from it. It's they are, if we do a documented practice and we provide transparency in how the data comes in and what data goes out of it, that transparency will actually help us provide that kind of auditing framework that is needed and that confidence level that, okay, right, they are following that stuff.
Right. Oh, excellent point. Thank you. Because, you know, the regulatory frameworks are always 2 steps behind the technology to begin with. Now you have a technology that's so young, right? But we think about it as if it's been around forever, and it really hasn't. It's been mostly in conceptual, just even 20 years ago. So thank you for that. And
FDA, talking about medical devices, so FDA and in pharmaceutical. So FDA is looking for those guidance. They started working on those guidance about 4 to 5 years ago. Even before that, they opened it for questions to the public. And they were reviewed and they were answered. I believe they are right now in the works where they're trying to put together a framework which will be acceptable.
I see. Okay, so
Sam has some, from her previous experience on FDA, has some experience on that. So I would like to hear what Sam is thinking about it.
You're bringing back to my hardware life, medical device life. Was traumatic. No, it was great. I learned so much. It's just, there's a reason why I moved to software. But we have the same question with software, because when you go for software as a medical device and that software is using, is AI powered, you have the same questions for the regulators. I think, listen, to the question of AI is such a big field. Again, you have so many techniques depending on what you're doing. You have, and we're dealing with that in healthcare, what we use for the pipelines to extract, the semantic intelligence from the data is different from how we use neural net. And neural net, the way they learn, again, we're still learning about them. So it's just, it's such a big field. But I think there is the regulator, there's also what the community is doing. So there are certain approaches. I think the FDA has released some guidelines around, diversity in clinical trials. Again, I think by working more with communities, having good representations, having those data pipelines of social determinants of health, so that you do not always recruit the same people from the same area.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so that's one thing. Berkeley, the MIT, they've been issuing a few, playbooks and guidelines. So there are things, USF with Rachel Thomas, they have groups working on that. It's very complex. I think sometimes, starting with the simplest checklist that I don't see in most cases.
Wow.
What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And who's on that team?
Yeah.
So we have a question that just came in from Tim Martin. And Tim asks, are there any I don't know if this is Manoj or you, Sam, but are there any standards bodies that will be providing guidance for healthcare AI bias and best practices? ISO, CE, ASTM. Any thoughts on who's going to be stepping up, or is this just going to be organic?
The thing is, all bodies are trying to step up.
Okay.
And it's a very, very good question. And given that there is no clarity or there's no consensus on what needs to be audited and what needs to be, and where does privacy, where does IP come into play, and how much transparency is needed, that is going to be the biggest question. So I can actually, who was the person who asked the question about?
Is Tim Martin?
So Tim, I can forward you a very good kind of research, and which is based on COBIT principles on these things. They have done this, and they are suggesting a framework which is being done. So my issue is that going to be accepted universally? No. The answer is no. Each body will have its own framework, and that is going to be the key. That how do we ensure that there is consensus in that framework?
Excellent. Thank you, Manoj. I guess I wanted to come back to you, Sam, for a second here. And we've talked about some of the regulatory pieces. We talked about opportunities, but now getting into sort of the non-traumatic, how did you say it, the software end of things. Can you talk about techniques that help with fairness? And you talked a little bit already about federated learning and data fluency. I don't know if it's anything more you wanted to say. I just wanted to make a comment here that the IBM has a toolkit for AI Fairness 360. I think it's in one of the chat sessions that we posted that you can access online, open source. But is there anything else you wanted to add related to the tools?
Yeah, just a few things. So number one, so there are techniques to debias an algorithm, or, you know, so there are techniques that we apply and they get better and better. But again, having standards is not a bad thing, because what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? What are the quotas we're supposed to use, depending on the situation? So that's something, again, that the community has to define. This cannot be left over only to engineers and scientists, I believe. And number two, I was mentioning what we call the concept of data fluency, which is a way to augment your machine learning environment. We have done that, it's deployed and we're using it, and it's working pretty well. And the beauty of AI, it keeps on getting better, but it's an environment where you can basically, you enable data scientists, AI engineers to collaborate. It's a cross-functional environment for the AI engineers, data scientists, clinicians, so the domain experts, but also the business team and ethicists, and, you know, as many and as diverse your team needs to be, without for that team to be a data scientist to understand how that model has been built and different type of filters to simulate how it could, you know, what's missing and what could be built differently. What is interesting about that environment is that it's also shortcutting the time that is needed to understand if there is viability and if there is value in the model that you're trying to build. So this has been done, this historically is taking months to understand. So you spend a lot of time and money before even knowing if there's value in that model. This is something we've been able to reduce to a matter of a couple of weeks. So it's also great for efficiency.
Excellent. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Manoj, but I also had another question related to sort of, we talked about the tools and the frameworks and the opportunities and the problems, but going forward a little bit, what about data? And I think, Sam, you had talked about a little bit, getting a good data set and the quality of that data and ensuring, right, it doesn't at all, when it comes to AI and ML, doesn't it all start with the data?
It does.
And the quality of the data set and the...
Yeah, here, the main issue comes into say is, hey, look, the quality of data sets and everything comes into play in these. But the question will always be raised is, how did you get that data set, right? And who governed it, by what principles?
Right.
So, so there is no way getting around those questions. Here are a few things that I try to document, or we try to document when we go out there. We want to make sure, A, there is a traceability. across the board. Where did you get it? How did you get it? And if I can trace that data through, there is some kind of a confidence level that is built in.
Sure.
There should be accountability. And I should, where I come into a lot of areas, as there's a lot of people, oh, who did it? He did it, they did it, oh, but the third party did it. So there is always this thing. So traceability, accountability, ownership, those are the key things. If we document these properly and if we self-police these things, there is some kind of confidence that when you go in front of any framework that you should be able to do it. And as Sam said, hey, look, she's doing it herself. And most of the companies are trying to be the better off on this, but there is always going to be a perception if you don't have a traceability and a kind of a visibility of the work you have done. There'll be always that question that, hey, look, where is this data and how did you use it? And I'll give you a good example, and I'm going to go right away from these things to, if you look at the facial recognition, is the most used AI right now. Right. And the facial recognition by the government is now, the government does facial recognition. You walk into the airport, there is a facial recognition going on there.
Sure.
Now, is there a bias built into that, and who controls that? Is government follows a framework? If you do follow a framework, please share it with us.
Back to the notion of trade secrets, right?
And you see, that's why I think there's so much value in including the patients, the consumers at the end of the network on the edge. And so our entire architecture is edge native, and it's very promising because it basically makes everyone a node. And the fact that now people collect their data on their phone, it's highly structured. And then that data gets communicated to another system if they want to share it. It's machine to machine, and it's very rich. And we have not been exposed to that kind of data before. So it's very promising. But the other part, again, I really want to emphasize the social determinants of health and the diversity pipeline. And today, we just released a report a few days ago of the healthiest states in the country. We have a ranking. Because we have a project called the Blue Zone Project, where we have an index called the Community Wellbeing Index, and we go per zip code, and we are even more granular than the zip code to really understand, how people live and what do they have access to. Again, where you live and what you have access to matters to how you get care. And so this is a huge bias. You can't. And we have to fill those gaps, or those algorithms will do the same mistakes over and over again. So all that new type of data that we can collect at the source with, consent by design, privacy by design, where people have the choice, and it's machine to machine. There's structured, rich data. There's a big opportunity there, and I think we should really, focus there a bit more on at the source where people are and how they can help participate if you make it more inclusive.
Right. I mean, you bring up a really great point. And by the way, I love the way you framed it. It's consent by design. It's, I don't know if you call it anti-bias by design. And it's not once, it's iterative, it's built into the process. And it's everything from the data, Manoj, to the tools that you're working with.
So, I did a little experiment 2 years ago. We have this concept called AI training. We crowdsource AI trainings. We basically put out there, we invite people all over the country to help us build algorithms and say, hey, this is what we're trying to build. This is why we're trying to build it. And we're trying to have as much data as possible, but as diverse as possible. So we did that for food, because we have a neural net that can capture food. We did that for mood. And so for the mood, we actually we gave people the choice at every single step. So first of all, we explained that we were trying to build an algorithm. We also asked people to share with us where they were living, and we asked them to share their ethnicity, and that was optional. They didn't have to, but we explained that we were asking that because we were very attent to make sure we would have, you know, a good representation of the population. And what we did, we didn't give a drop down predefined about what the ethnicity was. We just left a blank. We wanted to see how people perceive themselves. It was very interesting. So more than 85% of people who participated actually filled that blank, because, you know, and in that action, we also gave people the choice to stay on the edge or to share the data back to the cloud with a lot of transparency. And so we told them that by staying on the edge, they would help us verify the model, but by going to the cloud, they would help us correct the model. And there too, more than 90% agreed to share the data back to the cloud. So it's, you know, you just give people the choice, but you also explain. And of course, we shared the results. So which is also important because we ask people to share a lot of data. They give us a lot of love and we don't share it back. So that in clinical research too. So that's.
Is that just because do you feel people are more trusting of technology today than they've ever been?
I mean, many people don't know how the technology works. The big thing about data started when, you know, with all the scandals we've heard, but many people don't know how the data is collected. A lot of data is being collected and everything is hidden in those, you know, agreement, terms of services. People don't read all that. But yeah, I think there's value being transparent and make it more inclusive and explaining people. You want people to be part of the design team. That's what inclusiveness is, to avoid bias, I think.
Excellent. Manoj, I'm keying off something you said earlier about sort of this, right? Accountability on data. But, you know, companies, hospitals, right? They're all dealing with third party, right? They're sending their data. What's your thoughts on how we deal with third party suppliers in this framework?
It's a very good and a very fair question. And so actually, I would go back to how FDA operates in auditing and looking at reviewing your systems, right? At the end of it, if you own the system, the ownership lies with you. And so you cannot provide a finger pointing, you cannot do finger pointing to a third party. Hey, and even though I believe most of the development, engineering development is quite a lot of it's outsourced. I wouldn't say most, quite a lot of it's outsourced. That's our way we work nowadays. And but the corporate itself is profiting from the system that they have implemented.
Right.
Or they are based on the system that they've implemented. I think the ownership of that system lies with the corporates. And the way it goes in any of the audits, at the end of the day, the executive management is responsible, the board is responsible for this. They need to sign off. You do that in the financial industry. When you say, hey, look, I'm certifying and auditing these things, you have one of those big consulting companies sign off that, hey, and the board then certifies that, hey, look, yes, I attest to it. So I think the similar mechanism, so the mechanism does exist.
Right.
And it's just that we accepting it instead of just saying, hey, look, there's no mechanism, there's no framework. There are frameworks that we have in our history, so we can use those similar frameworks. I hope this helps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting because IBM's former CEO, Ginni Rometty, once said that data is the new natural resource, right? So we're mining it, we're storing it, we're aggregating it, we're curating it, right? And it's valuable. I mean, many
Google,
companies,
Facebook, Amazon, they're all database companies. That's what they do.
Right.
And if you have a proper certification and proper ownership of that to the executive level management and to the board, hey, look, we certify that this data is being done in a most transparent, unbiased way, you will have a remarkable change.
That's true. That's true. But back to your accountability, right? And ownership. So I guess I wanted to turn back to you, Sam, because the words you said are still sort of ringing in my head. And I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about, bias by design, bias by accident. You know what I mean? I mean, because it feels today like we are, if we're biased, it's just like, oh, we didn't mean to, right? We didn't mean to be biased. It just turned out that way.
Yeah.
Is that, you know what I mean?
I know, it's funny. I was just thinking when you were saying that it's by design, but it's almost schizophrenic. It's by design, but it's also by accident, because you said it. Said, oh, we didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. So when you don't know what you don't know, is it by design or is it by accident?
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's why I think having checklists, having standards, having best practices is so important. Doing the right thing, asking the right questions, having, asking the right questions at every single step of the way, and the intent is so important. But Manoj, I think you are the expert there, but when it comes to algorithms, I think it's also important to mention that you cannot push any algorithm in healthcare. I mean, it's highly regulated. When it comes to diagnostics, it's very, very complicated. So I think it's, we should not panic there. The bias are in the diversity aspect, which is it's a big thing. So we have to work there. There's many effort to do, but it's still very, very regulated when it comes to clinical diagnostics and softwares and medical devices. And Manoj, you were mentioning your own experience with what you are building right now, which is fascinating. So just wanted to make sure we were confirming this.
No, we are. And the point is, I think there's so much lack of information. There's so much lack of understanding that we always end up hiding under that. Either it's the regulators who is trying to hide it because they don't understand. Some of the regulators, yes, they do understand the compounds and everything. And I think that issue of digital economy has started building into FDA. I have participated in a lot of FDA discussions, and if you people are here, please connect to people like Bikkel, who is part of the FDA digital economy. So, and I would suggest that maturity's part lies with us for explaining to them and making them understand in more of easier terms, and what is that we can share, what is that we not. So and them trying to understand and building that knowledge base within their own setup, that is going to be the key. And there's always going to be pushback. Sam, you had pushback on the similar issues because there was lack of understanding. There was no previous cases which was similar to these.
Back to the maturity of the technology.
This first timers for many. Absolutely. And one of the things I wanted to get into over here, Enrique, is the issue about right now we are really at the infancy of AI.
Yes, right.
Very soon, AI is going to start building other AIs.
That's right.
I think if our fundamental base is not looked into, we will have AI is not going to be questioned by design. It'll be bias built by design, because we made a mistake in our initial AIs.
And they're replicated at high speed. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And at the same time, there are certain neural nets that are performing so well, it's magical. There are progress that are made. It's just you take GPT-3 from OpenAI in terms of language, it's magical. We've been testing it, training it on specific verticals, specific domain expertise in terms of pushing back language, it's wow, it's truly mind-blowing. I can tell you, I didn't know I would see that. So yeah.
So there's more to it than just the pain points and the biases. There's some magic here underneath here somewhere.
Yeah, no, there is. I think it has to be said, otherwise who?
So I wanted to pause here and see if there were any questions from the audience to our panelists today, and I just want to pause here for a second and see if there's anyone who wanted to ask anything of our distinguished panelists. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask if there's any closing comments, any words of wisdom you want to make sure that you impart, either reinforcing something you said earlier or saying something that you didn't feel I captured or prompted well. So I guess Manoj, for you.
I believe AI personally is a very promising system, and which is our future, the way we are going about it. There are a lot of positive things around it. But if there is just one bad apple, it'll put the whole industry in question. And there are bad apples. We do know those. And so having a framework, there's a consensus around the framework, will bring in that transparency that is needed. And it'll bring some kind of a closure to some of the questions that are built into the system itself. And I said, hey, look, even government needs to adhere to those frameworks and principles. And I brought up the issue about going to the airport, facial recognition. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what is there a bias built into it? Who they look into and what do they identify individuals? Right. Is there transparency in that? So if the government steps up, the industry will step up. And the big brother has to lead. That's how I would like to say.
Big brother has to lead. I like that. Thanks. Excellent. Sam, any parting comments, things you'd like to reinforce or things that haven't been said?
Yeah, so just a few things. So I would like to share a few positive things and maybe just, some concrete, steps that anyone can take, anyone. So number one, with my team, so our core expertise is AI. AI is a big field. And so again, there are many things you can address with AI. And so there are things we can fully automate. And that's fantastic because it's removing, the layers of errors that we've seen in healthcare that we don't want, with dramatic consequences. And there are things we cannot automate. And so when we cannot automate, we need collaboration and we need cross-functional team from day one, not only the engineers and the scientists building those algorithms, but you need the domain experts, clinicians, you need the business team, ETCs, regulators, designers, patients. You need everybody to make sure we collect the right data for the right reason and with the best outcome possible. And it's hard, but you have to make, if you are a leader, if you lead a team, if you lead an effort that involves AI, just use that checklist. And a few things we've been doing that are very simple, but it has helped us. So again, we go where people are. We leverage on the edge. People use smartphones. This is where people have the most access, even in rural areas. The penetration of the smartphone is amazing. We can access to people we could not access before. I think it has to be said, because removing bias is also giving more access, giving a voice to people who didn't have a voice. Build privacy by design, consent by design everywhere. It's not just I give consent once and that's it. It should be at every single step of the way, and it should be something you renew every single time, every time there's new data coming in. Then continuously address bias, not only at the beginning of the effort, but along the journey and at the end. They are the bias techniques. It's hard, but they exist. And incorporate social determinants of health. Where do people live? What do they have access to? What is the representation? All these things really matter. because there's no point pushing things to them if they can't even use those things at the end of the day. So, but there are a few things we've been doing with AI that are really remarkable. And so my big passion is research and how we can democratize clinical research and accelerate research and give a voice to everybody. And so we've been able to build some processes using AI that we couldn't do before. Take an example of the epilepsy, for example. So we have this clinical study with Stanford, with Dr. Fisher, where we are trying to build a predictive model for the optimal anti-epileptic drugs. So it's not anti-epileptic drugs, it's trial and error. Clinicians don't really know what works and what doesn't. It's very, very hard for patients because they go through very hard journeys of side effects. But it costs a lot to the system. So in one action, we could solve, 2 problems. And so those are hard problems to solve and so, there's hope. And so, but again, when you recruit participants, make sure you have participants from everywhere, diverse background, all ages, not only purely conditions, comorbidity aspect, all these things really matter. And so again, we have to put our minds into it and make the effort every single time.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Manoj. And thank you, Sam. I don't know if there's any other questions, but if not, I wanted to just pause here and thank you for joining this session on reducing AI bias in healthcare. If you get a chance, take a look at some of the tool sets that we posted in the chat. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. And it's been my pleasure having both of you, Manoj, Sam. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you for organizing this.
It's a good discussion.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you, Ashley and Christina. And we'll be signing off now. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye now.